The Clemson vs. South Carolina football rivalry is one of the wildest and most unique across all of college sports. Throughout its 100-plus year history, there have been absolutely no shortage of classic on-field moments and chaotic off-the-field events. But in this video, we will be focusing exclusively on the on-field portion of the rivalry as we take a look back at the 10 best on-field moments from Clemson vs. South Carolina. Starting us off at number 10 is the LaNorris Sellers game from 2024. Now, when we look back on this moment in 10 years' time, it may deserve to be a little bit higher up on this list, but for now, it's going at number 10. The Gamecocks entered that 2024 matchup riding an absolute tidal wave of momentum, having pulled off 3 upset victories over ranked opponents in the month leading up to the big game. Meanwhile, Dabo's Tigers looked very vulnerable, having lost a home matchup to Louisville and then nearly falling to an absolute mess of a Pitt squad just 2 weeks later on the road. But come game time, the Tigers, and more specifically their defense, would come to play. Through 3 quarters, they had held the Gamecock offense to just 7 points that came off a highlight reel scramble from Sellers himself. But Clemson would see their offense go deathly silent after going on an 11-play 75-yard drive to retake the lead to open the second half. The Gamecocks offense would finally be able to muster some second half points with a 42-yard field goal around the halfway mark of the 4th quarter. By this point, time was quickly running out, and the Gamecocks desperately needed something big to go their way. The USC defense would quickly force a second straight 3-and-out, and before you knew it, the ball was right back in Sellers' hands, and he was leading the Gamecocks deep into Tiger territory. However, they would find themselves facing a 3rd and 16 from the Clemson 20-yard line, and it was right here where a new legend would step forward and leave a lasting imprint on this incredible rivalry.
Harbor over to the right. Sellers in the pocket. Up in the pocket. Gonna run inside the 20. 10. LaNorris Sellers going left side. 5. Touchdown Carolina. Touchdown. Touchdown LaNorris Sellers. From 20 yards out. The Gamecocks take the lead at Death Valley.
Next up on our list at number 9, we have the Deshaun Watson ACL game from 2014. In our first trip back to the Dabo vs. Spurrier days, we look back on their 2014 showdown from Death Valley. At this time, Clemson were on the verge of their best run in program history, but this was a test that they had failed to pass year in and year out. So for them to truly reach that next level, they needed to prove to themselves that they could beat their biggest rival who had their number on a consistent basis. You see, up to this point in the Spurrier vs. Dabo era, Spurrier had been handing Dabo and the Tigers L after L for 5 straight years. So entering that 2014 matchup, it was imperative for Dabo to finally get one over on his in-state rival in order to help take his program to the next level. There was just one small problem. Clemson's freshman phenom quarterback Deshaun Watson was a serious question mark heading into the game, having not seen the field in 2 weeks and having not completed a full 60 minutes in almost 2 months due to multiple injuries. But once number 4 in orange trotted out onto the field, all of the pregame noise went out the window. The Gamecocks would go on to take an early 7-0 lead, but that's where the good times would end. From that moment on, Clemson would dominate the rest of the way, with Watson orchestrating the Tigers' offense to near perfection throughout the contest, even choosing to showcase his mobility a few times on a severely bummed knee. After falling behind early on, Clemson would go on to outscore the Gamecocks 35-10 the rest of the way, with it later being revealed after the game that their star quarterback had been attempting to play on a partially torn ACL for multiple weeks. It was a truly historic game in the rivalry, both for producing one of its all-time gutsiest performances, as well as it being the climax to one of its greatest coaching rivalries. Next up at number 8, we have the kicker duel from 2006. Now heading into that Saturday, Clemson seemed to be the clear favorite on paper, as up to this point, South Carolina had failed to capture a single victory over any of the ranked opponents on their schedule. This would include an absolutely gut-wrenching loss to the eventual national champion Florida Gators. who they had on the ropes up until a blocked field goal in the final seconds ultimately spelled their doom. Meanwhile, Clemson were having the exact opposite problem. The Tigers had no issue putting away the ranked opponents on their schedule, going 2-0 over the course of those games. It was the unranked teams that were continuously giving them their biggest difficulties, with the Tigers going just 5-3 against unranked opponents up to this point. So come game time, something had to give, and somebody's trends were going to get thrown out the window. From the opening kickoff, the game was pure madness all the way around. On one side, you had Clemson, who were continuously striking on long-range scores. Through 3 quarters, the Tigers would put 4 touchdowns up on the board, with 3 of those coming off plays of 75 yards or longer. Meanwhile, South Carolina, on the other hand, was choosing to put together long sustained drives that were wearing down the Clemson defense. They would also end up putting 4 touchdowns on the board through 3 quarters, with 3 of those drives containing 9 or more plays. In every way possible, these two teams were the complete opposites of each other, but somehow they would still enter the final 15-minute frame tied on the scoreboard at 28 apiece. The Gamecocks would go on to strike first in that 4th quarter with a 10-play drive that would set up kicker Ryan Suckup for a 35-yard field goal. In response, Clemson would put together a long drive of their own, using 15 plays to cover 58 yards that eventually set their kicker up with a chance to send the game into overtime, for what would have been the first time in the rivalry's history. But if you know anything about this great Southern rivalry, then you'll know that special teams in Clemson are like oil and water. They just don't mix. So as Clemson kicker Jad Dean trotted out onto the field for a 39-yard field goal attempt, the 80,000 Tigers fans packed into Memorial Stadium had to be feeling a sense of deja vu. Were special teams really going to doom them against the Gamecocks once more?
But here's Dean with a chance to tie it. There's Brickley with the push. 39-yarder out of Chason's hold. The kick is no good. Hook wide left.
Next up at number 7, we have the signing of the paw from 1992. To South Carolina fans, this is one of their all-time favorite moments of the rivalry. It was a season in which the Gamecocks had started 0-5 before turning to true freshman Steve Taneyhill in an attempt to salvage something from their miserable season. Over the following weeks, they would proceed to pull upsets on ranked opponents Mississippi State and Tennessee following the big change. This was part of a 4-game winning streak that would eventually be ended by future head coach Steve Spurrier in the Swamp the week before their big matchup with their in-state rivals. Clemson, meanwhile, were having a disappointing season of their own, still needing one final win to gain bowl eligibility. And unlike the Gamecocks, who were coming in with tons of momentum at their back, the Tigers were just 1-3 in the weeks leading up to the big game. The game would end up being a tight battle throughout most of the contest, but in the second half, the Gamecocks would clearly separate themselves as the better of the two teams. And it was after this 23-yard run from South Carolina running back Brandon Bennett that the Gamecocks' freshman quarterback would stop at midfield and sign his name on the Clemson paw. He would then throw his arms up in celebration, leading to this iconic photo that I can only hope hangs somewhere proudly inside the South Carolina football facilities. The Gamecocks would go on to earn a 24-13 victory that afternoon, creating one of their most legendary moments of the rivalry in the process. Coming in at number 6, we have the first top 15 showdown in the rivalry's history from 1987. In our first look back at one of the most magical on-field decades of the rivalry, we start with their highest ranking matchup the series would see in the 20th century. At this time, Clemson were in the final years of one of the best periods in program history under head coach Danny Ford. They would enter that 1987 season ranked inside the top 10 and were seen as a potential national title contender. The Gamecocks, meanwhile, entered the season unranked with plenty of question marks following their abysmal season the year prior that saw them win a total of just 3 games. Despite falling to ranked foes Georgia and Nebraska early on in the season, the Gamecocks would fight back with a 5-game winning streak that would see them rocket up the rankings into the top 15. This meant that for just the second time in the series' history, the two programs would square off with a number next to their names. Clemson would go on to start the game on a high note by putting together a 20-play drive that covered 91 yards before finally finding the end zone and hushing the over 70,000 South Carolina fans in attendance on that night. The Gamecocks offense would fail to respond throughout the first half, only being able to muster 2 field goals before the half would come to a close. But the story of the game was quickly becoming the Gamecock defense, who were ranked amongst the very best in the country and were dominating the Tigers at every turn. However, South Carolina would need their offense to come alive if they were going to come out on top. And after a couple massive stops to start the second half, the USC offense would finally break through.
The run and shoot. Ellis lost his footing. The middle's wide open. Ryan Buffet will go inside the 10.
Wide receiver making the play.
Harold Green. Touchdown, Gamecocks.
Defenses would continue to dominate the second half. However, time was quickly running out on the Clemson offense that suddenly found themselves taking the field with just under 7 minutes to play, trailing by 6 points. There was no doubt that they were going to have to turn up their aggressiveness, but unbeknownst to them, that aggressiveness would end up being their own undoing.
Williams has to put it up. Deep drop. Looks. Far sideline and picked off. Brad Edwards will get a convoy. Touchdown, South Carolina.
Next up on our list at number 5 is the Catch Part 2 from the year 2000. The rivalry's first appearance of the 21st century would see the two programs square off with a number next to their name for the first time in 13 years. Despite fielding one of the highest scoring offenses in college football, the Tigers would enter that matchup on a 2-game losing streak, fresh off an embarrassing 54-7 loss to the 4th-ranked Florida State Seminoles. In that game, they gave up over 750 total yards to the Seminole offense. Meanwhile, South Carolina were doing just as poorly, having also lost their last 2 games, with one of them being a beatdown by a top 5 team the week prior to their showdown with the Tigers. The game would end up being a defensive battle, with both teams only being able to muster 1 touchdown apiece through 58 of the 60 scheduled minutes of game time. However, the Tigers were able to add a couple of field goals to their total, giving them a 13-7 lead early in the 4th quarter. The South Carolina offense would continue to struggle throughout that final frame. That was until their back was firmly against the wall, knowing that they were touching the ball for potentially the final time. The Gamecocks would then proceed to drive deep into Clemson territory, with them eventually punching it in to take the lead after recovering their own fumble in the end zone. With less than a minute left on the clock, the Tigers were in all likelihood heading for a disastrous defeat on their home turf. Just a few moments later, Clemson would find themselves in an increasingly desperate situation at their own 42-yard line, facing a 3rd and 12 with just 19 seconds left on the clock. But you see, the thing about desperate times is that they often lead to desperate measures.
Rolling left, looking to throw deep down the middle. Gardner's there, and it is caught inside the 10. And there it is. If you get it through Gardner, he will catch it.
And Sean, they've been calling stuff all day. And, I agree, let guys play, but if you're going to call it one way all day and then at the end...
They called some ticky-tack stuff all day, and that was a pretty good shove to shed the defender that went unflagged.
No question. And if you're going to call it one way the entire day and then it comes down to the end of the game, I think you've got to call it the same way.
It all comes down to this. Awaiting the snap. The spot, the kick. It is up, and it is good!
Next up on our list at number 4, we have the first, and to this point only top 10 showdown in the rivalry's history. It's our final trip back to the Spurrier vs. Dabo era as we look back on their highest ranking matchup in the series thus far, which came back in 2013. Clemson entered that game as the number 6 ranked team in the country thanks to one of the best offenses in all of college football, with them sporting just one loss on their record that came in a beatdown at the hands of Jameis Winston and Florida State. South Carolina, on the other hand, were at the tail end of their best run in program history. At this point, they had all the momentum at their back, having won 4 straight games in the rivalry, all by at least 2 scores. And once kickoff came, it looked as though that streak was under no threat, as the Gamecocks would quickly race out to a 17-7 lead early. But Clemson was far from out of it, as they would scratch and claw their way back to tie the game late in the third quarter. The Gamecocks would go on an 11-play 70-yard drive in response that would see them retake the lead. Clemson would fail to respond on the following drive, as they would commit a massive turnover after driving down into field goal range. But South Carolina would be unable to take advantage of the massive turnover, and just a few moments later, they were forced to punt the ball right back to the Clemson offense. All the Tigers had to do was navigate a simple fair catch situation, and they would get their chance to tie the game once more. Simple, right?
On the fly from the 26, Humphries. And it's loose. South Carolina football. Harold Cooper out of the Wildcat formation. Gonna throw it, has a man. What a play. Wilds, touchdown. Surprise, surprise.
Next up, coming in at number 3, is the birth of the Orange Britches from 1980. Now, up to this point in their history, the Clemson Tigers had yet to add the orange pants to their uniform collection, but that would all change in 1980 thanks to legendary Tigers head coach Danny Ford. At this point in time, Clemson had yet to really take off under their now legendary head coach. The Tigers were in the midst of a down season, entering their matchup with the Gamecocks, sporting a record of just 5-5. South Carolina, on the other hand, were ranked 14th in the country and were being led by the 1980 Heisman Trophy winner in George Rogers. By all accounts, the Gamecocks were the clear favorites heading into their showdown with the Tigers in Death Valley. Clemson's head coach was firmly aware of the situation. In an attempt to spark a passionate performance from his team, he would order up the orange pants, which Clemson would sport for the very first time in their matchup with the Gamecocks. South Carolina would go on to put up an honorable fight early on in that game, but come the second half, the Tigers had completely taken over. The Clemson defense in specific would turn in their best performance of the season that day, not allowing the Gamecocks into the end zone a single time. This meant that legendary South Carolina running back George Rogers would graduate from the university, having never scored a touchdown on the Tiger defense. Clemson eventually went on to pull the upset that afternoon, finishing off a 27-6 victory. And with that, a new tradition was born. Clemson would go on to turn things around the following season, going on to win their first national title in program history. And of course, they wore the orange pants for their famous Orange Bowl matchup with the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Over the course of time, the orange pants would become more of a normal part of the Tigers' uniform rotation than they were during the earlier years of the tradition. However, Dabo Swinney has chosen for the most part, with a few exceptions of course, to go back to the old way of doing things, only busting out the orange pants for the very biggest of games. Famously, in tribute to the man who would create the tradition, the Tigers would wear the orange pants for their coach's final matchup with the Gamecocks in 1989. And as Clemson fans love to tell you, they just so happened to win that game by a score of 45-0. Next up, coming in at number 2, we have the Blackmagic game from 1984. For South Carolina fans, this is undoubtedly one of their greatest moments in school history. The Gamecocks would enter Death Valley on that Saturday as the 9th ranked team in the country, sporting a 9-1 record. They were also in the midst of a 4-game losing streak to Clemson that they were determined to finally bring to an end. The Tigers, meanwhile, were in the midst of a minor rebuild after their incredible run over the 3 previous years saw them win their first national title in program history. Despite entering that game unranked, Clemson were still a very dangerous opponent that just so happened to have one of the most explosive offenses in all of college football. And come game time, they were ready to unleash that top-ranked offense and spoil the Gamecocks' incredible season. And that's exactly what looked to be happening throughout most of the first half, as Clemson would jump out to a 21-3 lead early on. But you see, the Blackmagic moniker was about far more than just this one game, as throughout the season, South Carolina had found themselves in this position many times over. Throughout the season, the Gamecocks had become famous for their epic comebacks and ability to always have the ball bounce their way in the game's biggest moments. So when they fell behind 21-3 early on, the game was far from over, despite what the 80,000 Clemson fans in attendance had to say about it. The South Carolina offense would drive deep down into Clemson territory, looking to cut into the lead before halftime. However, the Tigers' defense would step up with a massive stop, forcing a field goal attempt, of which the Gamecocks would miss. However, there was a flag on the field, and Clemson were found to be the culprits. The Gamecocks would go on to punch it in just a few moments later to cut the lead to 11 heading into the half. South Carolina would go on to dominate the second half, with their defense continuously stepping up with big play after big play whenever need be. But the USC offense had been unable to find the end zone since that touchdown to end the first half, and suddenly they were getting the ball back for what looked to be the final time with just over 3 minutes left in the game, trailing by 6 and over 80 yards away from the Clemson end zone. Gamecocks starting quarterback Mike Hold was making his first start of the season on this day, and he was now being tasked with putting together an 86-yard drive in order to save the Gamecocks' Blackmagic season, and he would end up doing just that, capping off the drive with a 1-yard touchdown run that would tie the game at 21 apiece. And now it would all come down to a simple extra point, which they would miss. But remember what I said about Clemson and special teams? Well, they would get called for a too many men on the field penalty, giving the Gamecocks one final chance at redemption, of which they would leave no doubt that Blackmagic was in the air on that eventful day in 1984. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have the catch from their incredible 1977 matchup. With our final entry in this video, it's only fitting that we return to the birthplace of the rivalry for what is widely considered to be its best moment. Entering that 1977 battle, Clemson were the clear favorites, with the Gamecocks looking to pull the upset and capture the state championship, a storyline all too familiar throughout the rivalry's history. However, it was a major role reversal from the year prior, in which a 2-win Clemson squad shocked the Gamecocks in Death Valley, denying them a chance at the Peach Bowl. This year, South Carolina was looking to return the favor, but Clemson had a very experienced squad that knew exactly what they were in for. Or at least that's how things looked for a majority of the game, as the capacity crowd packed into Williams-Brice Stadium would see the Tigers storm out to a 24-0 lead around the midway mark of the third quarter. At this point, South Carolina was looking cooked, and any hopes they had of a miraculous comeback seemed to be put to bed. But when it comes to college football rivalry games, nothing is ever as simple as it may seem.
The middle to Dorsey. Oh, what an effort! Dorsey. And it is a touchdown. Great catch by Logan. He's got a blocker. He's inside the 10. Logan's going to go in. Sensational individual play.
Yeah, the the Gamecocks would come all the way back to eventually take the lead with just under 2 minutes left on the clock. It was a miraculous comeback that suddenly left the Tigers stunned and staring down the possibility of being on the wrong end of the biggest moment in the rivalry's history. But remember what I said just a few moments ago, when it comes to college football rivalry games, nothing is ever as simple as it may seem.
With 56, 55, first down for Clemson. Fuller in the end zone, he's got a man. Touchdown. Oh, what a catch by Butler. Oh, this is just an unbelievable football game.
Beyond being one of the greatest moments in the rivalry's history, for many spectators around the country, this was their very first exposure to this great Southern rivalry, as it was one of, if not the very first game in this series' history to be broadcast to a national audience via ABC. It was a truly historic game in the rivalry, and one that neither fan base will ever be able to forget.